Hi everyone, in this lesson we're going to learn about some of the rules of composition and visual weights that are used in illustration. These are fundamental in any kind of drawing. We need our illustration to be well composed and all the elements properly placed. So these rules will help your image make sense and work perfectly well. Let's start with the formats. So we have the vertical or portrait format, which is top to bottom, and the horizontal or landscape, which goes left to right or right to left. We'll mainly work with both these formats. They're basic in any kind of illustration. To draw characters or specific details, we usually use the portrait. And when drawing landscapes or more generic scenes, then we would go for the horizontal or landscape format. It also depends on your own personal taste or preference. So these two are the basic formats, but there are more. Some are even a little strange. You can find diamond-shaped, elliptical, triangular, and lots of other shapes. The format is entirely up to you, but just know that horizontal and vertical are the most common. It is important to choose an appropriate format before you start drawing, as this is how we compose our scene. What we're now going to talk about is the horizon line. That's the line that tells you where the horizon is on our drawing. And it's very important to establish this point, mostly when drawing outdoor scenes, but you can also find it in interiors. And this will determine the point of view from which we see the image. A low horizon line will give us a sense of tranquility and also spaciousness, but a high line might make us feel a bit overwhelmed. A central line with no harsh changes will bring balance to the composition. And finally, an inclined horizon line will feel oppressive and give us a sensation of chaos and instability. So a horizon line can help you transmit certain feelings. But if all you want is a balanced composition that isn't really saying much, that's more neutral, then I recommend using a central line, or one that's a little bit underneath the middle. Okay, let's move on to visual weights. Visual weights are very important in an image because they establish which elements are more important than others. They also tell us in which order the image is read. For instance, in this first option, we have a very strong image here on the left and a smaller one on the right. It's a balanced composition because they're more or less the same distance from the ends. The next image is quite monotonous, with two elements of the same visual weight at the same distance. In the third image, it's also quite monotonous, only with two smaller elements that don't seem very important. So I want you to understand the sensation each element gives off. In the next image, the main element is on the left and the secondary one is at the side. This means the composition isn't very balanced because we have the visual weight at one side and we just have emptiness on the other. We could see other examples of unbalanced compositions, like this one here. See how we have a small object on the left and another to the right, but still quite centered. This composition isn't very interesting because it doesn't really explain what we need to know. As a general rule, we need the elements to be well distributed, like a set of scales. In this composition, the secondary element is in the middle. You could say it's slightly more balanced. See how the main element is on the left. Like I said, when you're composing a scene, imagine you have a set of scales and the weights are balanced in the middle. So the elements that are more or less important need to be balanced depending on where they're placed in space. Now you know a bit more about composition and visual weights. what we're going to do is create various different compositions for our illustration. In mine, I'm going to have two main elements, the penguin with the gifts and the polar bear with two penguins on top. I'm going to do it with triangles. So the large triangle will be the penguin and the little one the bear. I'll make different types of compositions and see that they each work, and then I'll finally select the ones I like the most. As you can see, I'm varying the direction of the image. I mean the direction in which we see the main element and then the secondary one, or vice versa. The reading could go in various directions depending on what we want to transmit. In my case, as I want to transmit movement, something going forwards, it's probably more interesting if the first thing we see is the main element, so the one that's on the left and not on the right. These images you see below make the size of the secondary image vary. It's important to bear in mind the relation between the sizes of both elements if you have two elements or more. Our eyes always go first to the main element and then the secondary. As you see, I'm going with these two composition examples, which I'll use for my illustration. They are very similar, so all I'm going to do are test them out with different movements when I'm drawing my illustration. I'll shade the main element a little so you can see the relation between both of them. Now, in a vertical format, I'm going to do a general composition of all the main elements, and then inside a small sketch of my illustration to see how to compose it. I need to do this step before my illustration to know more or less where I'm going to place everything. As you can see, I'll establish the main element first, and then the secondary one. Then I'll start to sketch. Just very generally though, this is like a guide. So just a very simple, general sketch for my penguin and the presents. And this is because this isn't the definitive drawing. This is just a guide we can use while we're drawing the definitive illustration. Of course, we can apply the composition rules inside the composition of the gifts. All these rules work even inside the small details and elements that we find in the illustration, and it's always important to follow them. Remember that everything needs to be well balanced and composed. Now I see that my main element is quite far to the left. I'm going to select it once it's finished and take it over to the right with the lasso tool to balance out the composition a little bit more. And in the background, we're going to draw the polar bear. I'm going to draw some general basic lines that will guide me for my illustration. Remember that right now, we just need some lines that tell us where the elements are going. So in this case, I'm drawing the penguins and the polar bear very roughly. I don't really need much more than that. The same as we did before, I'm going to select the bear and block it a little bit better in the middle of the composition to balance everything out. See that now the elements and the weights are placed correctly. We've used the rules of the visual weights, a portrait format, and a middle horizon line to compose this drawing. So now we have all of this. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you some rules of perspective to know from which angle we're viewing the image, which will help us add depth to the illustration. So I'll see you there.